Picture this. It's the year 800 AD. Charlemagne, the most powerful ruler in Europe, is about to be crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome. The ceremony doesn't happen at noon in bright sunlight. It happens at Christmas Mass, deep in the night, inside a stone basilica, and the entire space is alive with hundreds of flickering candles. Now, here's the thing most people miss about that moment. The candles weren't just decoration. They were a carefully calculated display of power. Because in a world without electricity, whoever could fill a room with light was making a statement. I control something you don't. That's what this story is really about. We talk about candles like they're a mood setter, something you put out when company's coming over or the power goes out. But for thousands of years, candles were currency, status symbols, instruments of political control, and the backbone of some of the most important rituals in human history. By the end of this, you're going to look at a candle very differently. Let's go back to where it all started. The earliest version of the candle wasn't really a candle at all. It was a rushlight, a dried reed soaked in animal fat. And before that, people just used fire. Open flames in clay bowls, torches made from bundled plant fibers, stone lamps burning fish oil. Humans have been obsessed with portable, controllable light for at least 70,000 years, based on some of the earliest lamp finds in South Africa. But the candle as we'd recognize it, a wick embedded in a solid or semi-solid fuel source that starts showing up around 3,000 years ago in ancient Egypt and Rome. The Egyptians made theirs from tallow, which is rendered animal fat, usually beef or mutton. They didn't even use a wick at first. They just stuck a reed in a lump of tallow and lit it. It smelled terrible, it smoked, but it worked. The Romans refined this. They introduced proper wicks made from twisted papyrus and began making candles in molds. Roman candles, and I mean the actual historical kind, not the firework, were used in homes, in temples, and critically, in the political spaces of the Republic and later the Empire. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. In the ancient world, oil lamps were actually more common and more efficient than candles. So why did candles survive and eventually dominate? The answer is partly practical and partly psychological. Candles are portable in a way a lamp of liquid oil simply isn't. You can carry a candle. You can hand it to someone. You can place it precisely where you want the light to fall. That degree of control mattered enormously, and it turns out controlling light means controlling attention, atmosphere, and ultimately meaning. Which brings us to where candles get really interesting. Almost every major religion on Earth has made candles or fire central to its ritual practice. That's not a coincidence. It's a convergent discovery that light does something specific to the human mind. Think about what happens when you walk into a dark room lit by candles. Your pupils dilate. Your body instinctively lowers its guard just slightly or heightens its alertness, depending on context. The flickering is unpredictable in a way that's deeply hypnotic. Psychologists have actually studied this. Candlelight activates a kind of soft, diffuse attention that's distinct from the focused alertness of bright light. You're more emotionally open, more suggestible in the best sense of the word, more receptive. Ancient priests and religious architects knew this, even without the science. They just knew it worked. In Judaism, the Sabbath candles lit on Friday evening serve as a temporal boundary, a literal line of light that separates ordinary time from sacred time. 2 candles, 2 flames, and the week is divided. The act of lighting them isn't incidental to the ritual. It is the ritual. The blessing recited while lighting Shabbat candles is among the oldest continuous liturgical practices still performed today. In early Christianity, candles moved from practical to purely symbolic almost immediately. The Roman catacombs, where early Christians held their services underground to avoid persecution, were lit entirely by oil lamps and candles. The early church absorbed the symbolism of light from both Jewish and Roman traditions and amplified it. Christ is described in the Gospel of John as the light of the world, and the candle became the physical stand-in for that metaphor inside every church. By the Middle Ages, the church didn't just use candles symbolically, it controlled them economically and politically. More on that in a minute. In Hinduism, the Aarti ceremony involves waving a flame, often multiple wicks burning simultaneously before a deity. The flame is believed to take on the divine presence, and when turned toward the worshippers, it transfers blessing. The person receiving the light cups their hands over it and brings that warmth to their face. It's one of the most intimate ritual gestures I've ever read about, transferring something sacred from fire to human body. Buddhism has butter lamps, which in Tibetan practice burn continuously in monasteries as acts of devotion. The Shinto tradition in Japan involves sacred fire at shrines. Zoroastrianism, arguably the oldest surviving monotheistic religion, places fire at the absolute center of its theology. Eternal flames maintained in fire temples for centuries, some continuously burning for over 1,500 years. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Fire and controlled flame appear in ritual because they do something measurable to human consciousness, and ancient humans across completely separate cultures figured this out independently. That's a remarkable thing. But here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because in medieval Europe, candles stopped being just a religious tool. They became a mechanism of economic control so powerful that the church used them almost like a currency, and some very powerful people used them to run, of all things, auctions. In medieval Europe, beeswax candles were extraordinarily expensive. We're talking about a luxury item on par with fine spices or silk in terms of cost relative to income. The reason was straightforward: beeswax is difficult and slow to produce. A hive generates only a small amount of wax per year, and harvesting it was labor-intensive. Tallow candles were cheaper, but they smoked badly, smelled even worse when burned, and dripped constantly. The Catholic Church mandated that beeswax candles be used in all official ceremonies, not tallow, beeswax. This wasn't arbitrary. Beeswax burns cleaner, brighter, and with almost no smoke. But the mandate also had an economic consequence. It created a massive, continent-wide demand for beeswax that could only be met through large-scale beekeeping operations and trade networks. And who owned most of those operations? Monasteries. This is the part that blows people's minds when they first encounter it. Medieval monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic powerhouses, and one of their most important outputs was wax. Beeswax production funded buildings, libraries, political influence, and the day-to-day operations of institutions that were, in many cases, larger and wealthier than local lords. The church also used candles as instruments of excommunication. One of the most dramatic and terrifying ceremonies in medieval religious life was called anathema, the formal cursing and expulsion of a person from the Christian community. During the ceremony, candles were lit and then, at the climactic moment, extinguished and thrown to the ground. The symbolism was explicit. Your light is snuffed out. You are cast into darkness. Spiritually, socially, legally, because in medieval Europe those categories overlapped almost completely, you were finished. Now here's the thing I mentioned earlier, candle auctions. This is a real historical practice that continued in parts of Europe well into the 19th century. The concept was simple. A short candle, sometimes an inch long, was lit at the start of bidding for a piece of land or a lease. Whoever was winning the bid when the flame went out got the property. This created a peculiarly tense and theatrical bidding environment because nobody could predict exactly when the candle would extinguish. You couldn't stall. You couldn't bluff with time. The candle was the timekeeper, and it was merciless. If you find yourself genuinely absorbed by stories like this, the hidden mechanics of how ordinary objects shaped history, the Origin Archive covers exactly this kind of thing. Ancient systems, forgotten technologies, the small details that turn out to explain everything. Worth keeping around. We've talked about religion and economics, but the political dimension of candles is its own complete story. In royal courts across Europe and Asia, the number of candles present in a room was a precise indicator of status and power. Not a rough indicator, a precise one. The Palace of Versailles under Louis XIV burned roughly 3,000 candles on a typical evening. At major events, that number climbed to 20,000. This wasn't just aesthetics. It was a calculated political statement from a king who had literally built his identity around the imagery of the sun. Light equaled Louis. Louis equaled France. Maintaining this level of illumination required a permanent staff of candle specialists, the bougie, from which we get the modern French term for candle, and intriguingly, the English slang for bourgeois luxury. The people who managed royal candles were, in the hierarchy of palace staff, positions of real power. They controlled access to light, which meant they controlled atmosphere, which in practical terms meant they influenced which conversations happened in which conditions. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, the lighting of candles in certain royal ceremonies was itself a political signal. The number of candles permitted at a nobleman's table was literally regulated by law. Lighting too many candles in your home was not just tasteless, it was illegal because it implied a status above your station. Light, again, equals authority. In England, one of the more fascinating political uses of candles was in Parliament and in early public offices, where the end of the working day was literally marked by the extinguishing of the official candle. There was no clock on the wall in many early official spaces. There was a candle. When it went out, the business of the day was done. You can see echoes of this in our language. We burn the midnight oil. We talk about people burning out. We describe great people as shining lights in their fields. This language is old. It comes from a world where flame was the literal measure of time and attention. So we've gone from ancient tallow reeds to Versailles to coded political signals in candle counts. But there's one more dimension of the candle story that almost never gets told, and it involves the moment that should have killed the candle forever, but didn't. In 1879, Thomas Edison demonstrated a working incandescent light bulb. By the early 20th century, electric lighting was spreading rapidly through cities in Europe and North America. The candle should have become obsolete, and in practical terms it largely did. Nobody was navigating their home by candlelight out of necessity by 1930. But the candle didn't die, it transformed. Global candle production today is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Americans alone spend over $3 billion a year on candles. That number has been growing, not shrinking. The question worth asking is, why? The answer brings us back to everything we've already covered. When candles stopped being necessary, they became purely symbolic, and it turns out that symbolic value was so deeply embedded in human culture and psychology that it didn't go away just because we had better alternatives. If anything, the symbolism intensified. We light candles at birthday cakes, a ritual that traces back to ancient Greek offerings to Artemis, where honey cakes with lit candles were placed at temple altars to mimic the moon's glow. We light candles at vigils, at funerals, at romantic dinners. The associations are completely consistent. Candles mark transitions. They signal that something important is happening. They say, this moment is different from ordinary life. Psychologists who study ritual behavior note that the physical act of lighting a candle, the striking of a match, the moment of ignition, the breath held just slightly until the flame catches, constitutes a genuine psychological threshold. Something shifts when you light a candle. You've done something irreversible in a small way. The moment is now different. That's the same power that Charlemagne's coronation was leveraging in 800 AD. The same power the Jewish Shabbat candles invoke every Friday evening. The same power the medieval church used to terrify and to console. The technology of the candle barely changed for 2,000 years. But what humans kept finding in it, control, meaning transition, the marking of time, that turned out to be permanently useful. So next time you light a candle, whether it's for atmosphere, for a birthday, for a prayer, or just because the power went out, you're participating in one of the longest continuous human practices in existence. You're doing something that an Egyptian priest, a Roman soldier, a medieval monk, and a French king all did before you, for reasons that weren't entirely different from yours. The candle is a technology for making meaning. It always has been. That's the kind of story the Origin Archive exists to tell, the hidden histories inside the ordinary objects and systems that we walk past every day without a second thought. If that's interesting to you, you know where to find us. Until next time.